Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Yep, looks good.
I know, I see it coming.
Welcome, everybody. I think we'll go ahead and get started. It's my pleasure today to introduce Rob Capra to you. Rob recently finished his PhD at the Virginia Tech University, and is currently working at UNC in Chapel Hill, right? And he's going to be talking today about information related to his dissertation work, where he was working on keeping found things found, among other things, and I'll let him explain the rest, but please welcome Rob.
Thank you. Yeah, so I'm going to talk about how people refind information on the web. So the classic problem that you have is you've seen something out while you were browsing around on the web, you want to get back to it, and where is it now? How do you find it? So this is work that I did as part of my dissertation at Virginia Tech, and is very closely related, as Mary mentioned, to projects that have gone on here at Microsoft, like the Stuff I've Seen and FLAT and the University of Washington Keeping Found Things Found project. So let me start off by defining what I mean by talking about information refinding. So there's a lot of research that's been done on how people find information. So if you think about all the work that's gone into search engines and in the information science community and library science community, there's a lot of work that's gone on in terms of modeling how people find things. Less work has been done that looked at how people get back to things that they've found before. So refinding has to do with relocating something that you've seen previously. It could be an email, it could be a document, it could be your calendar, it could be a web page. I focus mostly on web pages, but in the broader scope, it could be any of those things. There's been more interest in this recently with personal search tools, Windows Desktop Search, Google Desktop Search, things like that. And there are also some important mobile issues that come into play, where what if you found something on one machine and then you go home and you're trying to refind it on your computer at home? Well, if you bookmarked it at work, that bookmark isn't at home. So there's some interesting issues there. And one of the things that some studies have found is that people will use their cell phone as a device proxy. So if I am away from my computer and I need to find something, I can call my wife and say, "Sweetie, can you look this up for me? I can't get back to it." And so that's one of the interesting mobile things. But for this talk today, I'm going to focus on web page refinding. So for my dissertation work, I looked at a couple different things. And one part of it is, how is refinding different from finding? What can we say about the process that makes those two things different? And what factors affect how people go about refinding information on the web? So just to get you up front in on what I was doing, I had 4 questions that I looked at as this part of the dissertation. 1, do refinding and finding differ? 2, how does your familiarity with a task? And how does the task itself, different tasks may be easier or harder to refind. And so we're kind of interested in what tasks are easy and difficult. How does the similarity of the task from finding to refinding affect that process? And I'll go into more detail about this one. It's a little more complicated to explain, but if the task was identical when you found it and refined it, maybe it's easier or harder. And then what strategies do people use? So, what do we know about refinding? Not much. Well, actually, we know a few things. Okay. There's been a lot of research that's been done that's kind of around the periphery of this area. So we've looked at things like bookmark usage. And there are a lot of conflicting studies on bookmark usage. Studies that have shown that people amass a lot of bookmarks, studies that show that people get lost in their bookmarks because they have 200 bookmarks and they can't figure out what any of them mean because page titles aren't descriptive. Lots of mixed results on bookmark use. We've also got results that say that users recall searches. If you go out and search on the web, you actually recall those searches in terms of patterns and waypoints. So you might remember a routine that you used to find something, or you might remember an important key website along the way. Well, I got to it because I was on the Blue Cross Blue Shield website, and that had a link to go to this other place. Another thing that we've seen is that artifacts play an important reminding function. And this is true on the web, it's true on desktops as well. So, why do we keep piles of papers on our desk? Because those piles help organize and remind us about things that we have to do and where information is located. And there's been a lot of studies that have looked at finding and reminding and filers, people who always file things into folders versus people who keep piles on their desks, and how people organize their desks. So some of this research goes way back into the 80s when we were looking at how desktop and initial file systems were organized. Recent result from Jamie Teven was that search is not good enough. You need more than search. You need context. You need to be able to browse in that space and keep the context of things that you've seen before rather than just typing in a keyword to refine something. We also have seen things that people tend to revisit a small number of pages a lot of times. So if you look at some of the query log or weblog usage studies, there tend to be these distributions where there's small numbers of pages that people are always going back to, and then it sort of trails off. Also have seen some research that talks about how people go about the process. They often do what's called orienteering. So they will remember certain small steps to how to get somewhere. So if you think about, how would you get from here to the White House in Washington, D.C.? Well, you might think, okay, well, I'll get on this interstate, and then I'll take that interstate a long way, and then I'll figure out from there. And you think of it in smaller incremental steps. So a number of other things that have been found by the Keeping Found Things Found project are that people are interested in portability and access points. How can they get to their data? Having things remind them of things they have to do and how they can reuse the data. And that this whole area we know little about and it needs more study. There have been a number of tools that have kind of started to scratch around on this surface, some that have gone back into the mid-90s. There was some work out of MIT, the Remembrance Agent, and Margin Notes that tried to track what you were doing and make intelligent suggestions of things that you might be interested in along the way. There's a Haystack project also at MIT that does sort of a similar thing. It searches all the emails and all the documents on your desktop and tries to create connections between them so that it's easier for you to find and refine things. Web annotation, shared bookmarks, and tagging all fit into this realm. Definitely the work here on Stuff I've Seen, Flat, and the desktop search, and Google desktop search are also things that fall into this area. Now, I want to take just a minute before I describe my study and the results from my study and try to put this in a perspective from information science. Information science has been around for a while, and they have developed a number of models of how people seek and search information. And this is something that really the refinding and personal information community and the HCI community hasn't quite looked at so much, and I think there's some value to. So in terms of information seeking behavior, there are a number of models. I'm just going to highlight a couple of them. Ellis has a model that talks about different features of the process that, you start out, and you might do things like chaining. Chaining is where you go from one resource that points to another resource that points to another resource, and you follow that chain, and you can do forward and backward chaining. Just simple browsing, differentiating, monitoring. And so they have a number of features that play into a model of how people go about information seeking. There's another model that goes through stages. You start off with sort of an initiation stage where you're not always quite sure where you're going to get to, and then you select certain resources to look at, and then you explore those resources and you start to formulate exactly where it is you need to go in that search process. You collect information and then you present that information. In terms of actual searching behavior, there are also some models about the specifics of the search process. So you can think of seeking as sort of a higher level process, and then searching is something that you do as part of seeking. And I don't want to go into too many details of these, but I do want to highlight one of the models by Vakkari, that looks at specific actions that people can take as they look for information. Now, the reason that this is important in a talk on information refinding is that if we can look at models of how people go about finding information, maybe there are things that are important in terms of how people refind information. So maybe some of the same characteristics and dimensions that have been looked at in terms of information seeking can also be important to refinding. So in this model, prior knowledge of the domain, of the scope, and how the problem is laid out, task complexity, in other words, how complicated is the task, how well do you know what the outcomes are, and the problem structure, is it a well-defined problem or an ill-defined problem. Those things all interplay, and all of those three affect the actions that you might take to actually go about that process of finding the information. And that can play out into how you use the information, the search strategies, what you decide is relevant, and so on. So what I'm going to do is map some refinding concepts that I looked at into this model of information actions. So prior knowledge, I looked at in terms of how familiar someone is with a task. How frequently do you do it? How familiar you are with that task. Task complexity, I looked at fairly directed tasks. Most of these were known item type searches, where you're looking for a specific piece of information that you fairly well know to exist. Find a specific web page. Find the weather in Seattle for today. That type of task. We did include a few other tasks that had to do with more browsing type behavior. Things like find a sweater that you'd be interested in buying someone as a gift. And I'll talk more detail about that. But these were fairly structured and fairly directed tasks. And in terms of measuring the information actions that people took, I looked at things like time, the number of steps it took them, which was measured by the number of URLs, the search engine use, how much did they use search engines and how did they use them, and a few other measures that I'll talk about. And so hopefully what I'm kind of doing is looking at information refinding from a perspective of this model of information science. By the way, if you guys have questions, feel free to interrupt me as we go.
What do you mean by search engine use? Is it what search engine or changing search engines, or how they use it?
In this study, I looked just, did they use a search engine for the task at all? And so we measured, we coded for MSN, Yahoo, Google, AltaVista, probably a couple others.
So if they went to a e-commerce site, or supposing they went to Amazon and used a search that
we did not record local site search. There was someone else in our group that did a study that looked at local site search, but I didn't look at local site search. But that's a good question. It's a good point. This was just general web search engine use. Okay. I want to say one or two quick things about why this is sort of a difficult area to study. Refinding is a demand-driven kind of behavior. It's very opportunistic. When you need to refine something, it's kind of unpredictable. Some demand has presented itself, and you just need to go back and get to that information again. It's very hard to reproduce that setting in a lab. It's very hard to measure that by observing people because they don't happen with predictability. I might sit with you for an entire day, and you might only need to refine a couple of things, depending on what it is you're doing that day. So different techniques are used to measure refinding. In situ observation, where people will actually go and try to observe what people are doing, interviews, diary studies, other retrospective type techniques. data logging techniques where they might install a proxy or other type of data recording software on your machine and then go back and see what it is that you needed to refine, and laboratory studies. Now, I chose to do a laboratory study even though it has some drawbacks because I was interested in isolating certain factors that can't really be measured outside of the lab, and hopefully we'll see why that is in a few minutes. Okay, so just to summarize, research questions: do they differ, task familiarity, similarity, and strategies. So what I did for the study was I recruited 21 participants. These were all undergraduates at Virginia Tech. They were widely recruited, so we didn't end up just with computer science majors or just engineers. We found that offering undergraduates $20 and putting up signs in the dorms got you more people than you knew what to do with. And so we had 21 participants. For various reasons, there were 2 sessions here, and so only 17 ended up with usable data. So the results I'll present here are based on those 17. And there were 2 sessions, about a week apart. And what would happen is the participant would come in for the first session, and they were given a set of 18 tasks. They would do those 18 tasks, and then we sent them away for a week, and then they'd come back, and we gave them another set of 18 tasks in their second session. And the second set of 18 tasks were basically the same tasks with a few differences that I'll talk about. We did screen recordings and logs of all the URLs that they visited. And so most of the analysis is based on the log of URLs and timing data that we got off the screen recordings. Just to give you an idea of how this worked, there was a program that we used to guide the participants through the study. And it was a Visual Basic program that just kind of sat in the background. So we would present them with the task. They would read the description of the task, answer a few questions about their prior experience with that task, and then go and do the task in the browser. So we measured frequency by asking how often they did this type of task in their day-to-day life. And that was on a scale that you can see here that dealt with time. We measured perceived difficulty, and we also measured this after the task. So we had before and after task difficulty. And we also asked about how well they think they knew how to get to the information on sort of a Likert-type anchored scale.
This
Yep.
may be too much detail, but what do you do with the information? Is it going to, for example, the Hotmail page or going to the page?
Well, okay, so the example here is go to a web page where you can log in to read your email. So I'll just ask you, how well do you know how to get to that page?
Very well.
Okay, so, you know.
Yeah, can do it pretty blind.
Yeah, so it's you know, in terms of how well do you know how to get there, you know, it sounds like your response would be probably.
This is just getting to the tool, not to my particular page.
No, actually getting to this page.
Okay,
So-
getting to the login page.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So, you know, if you know the URL, you would have probably typed it in, you probably memorized it, you would probably have said, I know exactly where it is. Now, if I ask you how to get to my web page, I don't know. Maybe you feel confident in your ability to find my page because you know my name. And so maybe you would have marked a high score. Maybe you're not sure if I have a web page, so maybe you would have marked a lower score. Okay. So there were a number of controlled factors, obviously task and participant, and then session. There were session 1 and session 2. We had a number of responses to these task questions. We asked about frequency and familiarity and perceived difficulty, both before and after the task. And then we recorded certain measurements. We recorded the task completion time. We recorded the number of URLs and the number of search engine uses. And actually, most of what I'll talk about here was we used a ratio measure on the search engine use because if you had a task that required a lot of URLs, that could offset, you know, you'd see using one search engine use versus if you had one search engine use in a task that only had 2 URLs. So usually I talk about a ratio measure there. So of these 18 tasks, there were really a set of 12 that we did most of the analysis on. 5 that couldn't be analyzed across the session for various reasons, and then 1 that had a very low completion rate. So most of the tasks that I'll look at in the analysis here are called the EP15 set, which is just called that.
Did you give the task to the users in the same order?
No, the order was varied.
And is there any fatiguing?
The session lasted approximately an hour, and so we didn't see any fatiguing in the users. Most of these were tasks that they didn't spend a whole lot of time on. There were a few cases where people did give up on a task.
Did it just take longer or not do as well?
You mean in terms of like the end of the session after an hour? We didn't really see any. I didn't try to measure for that, but I didn't see that. But the design, the tasks were presented in random order, and then what we did on the second day was we took the ordering that had been used on the first day, so that we made sure that they got all the same tasks they had done, mixed that up, and then added the ones they hadn't done at the end. So anyway, so let me dive into some of the research questions here. And again, if you have any questions, feel free to stop me, and I'll try to answer. So first research question was to look at, are there differences between finding and refinding? One way to do that is to say, okay, in the first session they were finding, in the second session they were refinding. So do we see any differences based on session? And here we looked at session by task. So the blue asterisk areas here indicate significant effects at 0.01. And we did see that session by task was significantly different in terms of time and in terms of the participants' familiarity with the tasks, but not in terms of the number of URLs or the search use. So let me dive in a little bit and look at this particular block and show you the post hoc analysis that we did on that. So in terms of time, there were some tasks that were significantly different, but there were some tasks that weren't. So there was one task that asked the participants to find a flight reservation. Go out and find a fare for a flight from Roanoke to Washington, D.C. on this particular date. And this had a very drastic improvement from the first session to the second session. And it's interesting because when we started thinking about this, these were all undergraduate students at Virginia Tech. Now, I don't know if you guys know where Virginia Tech is, but it is in the middle of nowhere in southwest Virginia. Virginia is a fairly, close state, and so most of these students, if they went anywhere, drove. And so even if they lived in D.C. or somewhere else in the state, they probably drove. Not a lot of these students had occasion to book airline reservations. And so that's why we think there was such a dramatic improvement here. There was one here where we asked students to find a certain professor at Georgia Tech, their website, John Staskow. And so students were familiar with finding professors' websites, but not outside the Virginia Tech system. And the Georgia Tech system worked a little different than the Virginia Tech one. Virginia Tech has something called a people finder on the main homepage. You just type in their name and it takes you to the page. Georgia Tech didn't have one that worked the same way as Virginia Tech. So there was some learning involved there. Another one that was significant, that was kind of interesting, was we asked people to find a solution to the Rubik's Cube. Seems like, pretty straightforward kind of thing. This is one where it turns out it's very easy to do. You just go to your favorite search engine and type in Rubik's Cube solution, and you've got about 100 sites that tell you how to solve the Rubik's Cube. And so this is one that I think in the first session people were just a little unsure about how to formulate that query. And then the second time around they knew exactly what to do. But there were a lot of tasks that we gave them that didn't have a significant difference from one day to the next. So in answering this question, one way to look at this is to say, well, yes, there are differences in refinding and finding for some tasks, but maybe not for all the tasks. Yeah?
I actually see one where the
time, second time around is significantly higher. What happened to that? Very first one. Yeah.
Where this?
The very first one. The smallest bar.
16? So you're asking why there's not an asterisk there?
No.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I look at the error bars.
Oh,
and I
okay.
see the time for
Yeah.
finding is higher.
Yeah, I don't remember what task that was, but it was. Oh, that's probably the weather. That's probably finding the local weather. And I think what you're seeing there is that for some reason people didn't do as well on the second day, but it's such a small amount. It was not significant, so we can't really say that it was. I mean, from a statistical standpoint, these are equivalent, right? Because I'm only showing standard error here. Significance at 0.05 I've indicated with the asterisk, so this is not statistically different. Okay? Yeah?
Do you have a plot that also shows the familiarity meter? Is there any correlation?
Yeah, I may have. I don't remember. I had to trim down some of the results to fit it into the amount of time I have. But you're talking about a correlation between time and familiarity?
Yeah, what they plot in terms of familiarity. How familiar are they with the past?
Okay.
What
Let
they
me
got from them?
get to the familiarity slide and see if that answers your question. But ask me again if it doesn't. Maybe this will. Okay. So we did also look at the session by task in terms of familiarity for the post hoc analysis. And again, this is very interesting too, because you have a number of tasks where their familiarity went way up on the second day. Now, I guess you were asking about the correlation between the two. I don't remember if we looked specifically at that, but I imagine there is a correlation because Professor's website and Rubik's Cube and things are on there, so there's probably some correlation. But it's also possible that people may feel more familiar with a task, but not necessarily have a timing improvement. And that's actually an interesting point, because time doesn't always tell you everything you need to know. Just because somebody performs faster on a task doesn't mean that they had a better experience with that task. And so, familiarity may get at some of that. So here again, we see that some of the tasks did have higher familiarity on the second session and some didn't. A lot of these ones that didn't, you can think of as a ceiling effect here. People were already familiar with some of these tasks. Maybe they were tasks they did in their day-to-day life. And so maybe they had nowhere to improve in terms of feeling more familiar with it. Some phone number lookup tasks, stock price lookup tasks. It turns out that from this study, it looks like undergraduate students don't do day trading anymore. When I started my PhD back a few years back, everybody was day trading and knew exactly how to look up stock prices on the web. I actually had them look up Microsoft stock, and most of the students didn't know the Microsoft ticker symbol. So anyway, there you go. So this kind of gets at a question.
Maybe you'll address this later, but the tasks that improved the most significantly were the Rubik's Cube, the flight lookup, and I don't recall the third one.
Okay, in terms of time?
Yeah. But the professor's website. So these were things with which they were initially unfamiliar. Basically what I'm getting at, are you measuring refinding, or is this more a measure of learning?
Okay, that's a good question. So we know, all we know here is that in session 1 they performed this way, and in session 2 they performed this way. So let me slice the data a different way now. In the previous slides that I showed you, I operationalized refinding by session. I said, okay, session 1 is finding, session 2 is refinding. But that totally ignores people's prior knowledge of a task. Maybe in session 1 they were already an expert. Maybe it was already a refinding task for them in session 1. So another way to operationalize refinding is to take that question I asked them about their prior frequency and say, if they do this task frequently in their day-to-day life, then even in session 1, we might consider it as a refinding task. Does that help answer your question too? Okay, so we could say high frequency is refinding, low frequency is finding. And there's issues with doing that too, though, because then all of a sudden you're moving from not tightly controlled factor to something that is more of a measured factor, and your stats get ugly. But it does account for individual experience, and so that helps you. Yeah?
In which case you should also consider familiarity, because even if you don't do something often,
yes. So that's interesting too, and I'm going to come back to that point at the end of the talk, the relationship between refinding, finding, familiarity, and frequency. Okay? Okay, so let me show some results on looking at the prior frequency as the indicator of refinding. So this is basically the same analysis we did before, but just using prior frequency instead of using the task. So what we found here was that, again, time and familiarity were significant. And I'm going to drill down into prior frequency and time. So the tasks that people had high prior frequency in doing, not surprisingly, those didn't improve in the amount of time they took. The tasks that they rated as medium or low frequency did have a significant increase or decrease from day 1 to day 2, session 1 to session 2. So it's kind of a nice result that says, okay, yes, they got something out of it. But it's also an interesting result because what it says is that with 1 session of experience and a 1-week gap, people improved a lot on this task. And in terms of studying refinding, that's an important result because, well, would they have that same increase in performance 3 months later? We don't know. I'll have to do another study and come back and tell you about it. But we know that within 1 week, they retained some of that knowledge and did better on the task the second time. Okay, so again, I'm not able to show you all the results, so I'm kind of slicing some of this up. But I want to look at the effects of task and familiarity, and specifically I'm now going to talk about familiarity. Okay, just showing you a slice of this, I looked at how session and prior familiarity fit together, and we got a significant result for prior familiarity, both in terms of time and in search. So this is kind of interesting. Again, not altogether surprising, but the tasks that you have more familiarity with, you don't use search as much for. And this was a very nice stacked result here. All 3 of these are significantly different from each other. So high, medium, and low familiarity all corresponded to different levels of search. So, the more familiar you are, it seems like there's kind of a linear looking model here in terms of how much you use search. It's also interesting, I'm going to go back a few slides. Oops, I'm going forward. Hang on. Okay, so in this analysis where we looked at session and task, you may notice that search did not differ across session. So what this is kind of saying is that if you use search in the first session, you used it in the second session. If you didn't use it in the first, you didn't use it in the second. It looks like refinding doesn't really have an effect on search. It looks like task is the thing that's affecting whether or not you use search, which is also an interesting result because a lot of the refinding work that's gone on tries to increase the use of keyword search. Yeah?
What percentage of time people use search?
Can you say again?
What percentage of time did people use search? If it's 90%, then that task that you have go to your email. I never use search for that, but I use search for everything else. And I'm still going to use search for everything else. it would be important to know what the percentage of time that people use search.
What percentage in these tasks?
We'll go to this.
Yeah. Well, this is looking at.
Can you define what the ratio is? I didn't find.
Yeah. Okay. So.
Let's show the ratios.
Yeah. When I talk about. Which one, Mary?
The search engine ratio,
I got to go back here. Is this it?
where you have familiarity and search engine ratio use.
All right. Just tell me when. Tell me when to stop.
The result you've just shown me
Oh.
went all the way back.
Okay. All right. Well, let me do this one. So the search engine ratio is the number of times you used a search engine divided by the total number of pages you saw. Okay. So if you had 10 pages, 10 URLs that you viewed, and one of them was the search engine, that would be 0.01. And it's just a way of normalizing search engine use. I mean, it's trying to take the concept that if I only looked at 2 pages and one of them was a search engine, that's very different than if I looked at 10 pages and one of them was a search engine. So it's trying to say there is some difference. I will tell you, I looked at this both in the raw number of counts and in terms of the ratio. They were basically the same. And so, you know, I just went with the ratio because I think it's a little more true to what you're really trying to get at in terms of search engine use.
So what are we supposed to take away from this? The experts,
So, yeah.
hit lots of pages or don't hit lots of pages?
What you're taking away from this is this doesn't tell you anything about the number of pages. This tells you that if I have high familiarity with the task, I don't use search engines very much. And if I have low familiarity, I use them a lot in terms of the relative set of the task. And this also kind of gets to that there are tasks that people know how to do and there are tasks that people don't know how to do. Yeah?
It's basically, you know, if the task is navigational and you don't know where to navigate to and you're using the search engine to navigate, it's one thing. But if the task is to go deep in search, now some search engine will come specific like this.
Yeah.
So you can understand it at one level, but
Yeah.
I'm not sure if you capture that here. And it's not like, you know, it's a simple task or a difficult task. It's the kind of task.
Right. Well, and that's...
I was thinking with familiarity, if you're really familiar with something, you might quickly find a ton of information on something.
Right.
Which because you hit a lot of pages.
Well, okay, so these tasks, keep in mind, these tasks were directed tasks to find basically a single piece of information. And so the tasks were sort of normalized because all the tasks were looking for a single piece of information for the most part. There were a couple tasks where we asked people to do a little more than that, and I'll distinguish those. But I probably glossed over this a little too much. In the slide where I told you the tasks that we excluded from this analysis, we left those types of tasks out. Okay. All right. Everybody still with me? Good. So in trying to tease out some of these effects of task, and really what I think you were getting at in the back was that task is a very important part of this. That task, that's one of the things that has come out of this, and it's been known in the HCI community that task is important, and we're seeing it again here in this study, is that the type of task you're doing has a lot of effect on how you go about that search process and refinding process. And we found some trends across a few of these measures. So some of the tasks that tended to be easier in the measures we looked at, in other words, the time was less and the difficulty was rated lower and so on, were things like looking up a word in a dictionary. So we asked them to find, you know, the definition of some word. Almost everybody knew dictionary.com or mw.com or one of those two. Finding movie times, you know, big surprise, college students go to movies. They all had a favorite site to go to look up movie times. Finding local temperature, something people do often. We asked them a task to find what the dates were for spring break that year. They all knew exactly where to go to find that because they're on the Virginia Tech website all the time. Things that were more difficult across a lot of the measures that we looked at were the flight reservation task I mentioned, the Rubik's Cube task because they had trouble with it on the first day, the finding the professor's website on the other university. We gave them a task to try to find the distance between two locations on a map. That turned out to be a difficult task because it involved looking up different pieces of information. One that was kind of surprising, we asked them to find an instruction manual for a particular VCR, and it was a Panasonic whatever model. And it turned out that you couldn't find the manual by searching in a search engine. And if you went to the Panasonic site, if you didn't follow a very precise set of links, you couldn't search for it or find it. And so this turned out to be a very difficult task for people because it was hard to find and it was hard to re-find. So I want to start talking now about task similarity. And before I get into this, I want to talk about what I mean by task similarity because this is something that is unique to refinding and is sort of part of the contributions of what I've tried to put forward in my dissertation work. Is that if you think about refinding, you saw the information once, you found it once, and now you're kind of trying to come back to it. Well, maybe you're doing exactly the same task. So, you know, in the first session, find the phone number for this particular art store in Blacksburg called Mish Mish. The second session, find the phone number for that same art store. Same task. Well, what if the tasks were just slightly different, but the information was along the same path? So there's a grocery store on Main Street, and there's another Kroger on University Boulevard. So what if the first time I was trying to find the phone number for the one, and the second time I was trying to find the phone number for the other? Well, those pieces of information are on the same place. They're in the same place. But it's just a little bit different. So we talk about those as path tasks. The information could be a subset of what you found before. So if I ask you to find 2 sweatshirts that you might want to buy as a gift for a friend, and then the next day I ask you to find one of those 2 sweatshirts. So it's a subset of what you saw before. And this is actually a very common kind of thing to do. You go out and you find a number of things, and then there's really only 1 or 2 of them that you're interested in getting back to. And this is another thing that I'd like to follow up and do more studies on in future work. We only had 2 of these tasks in the study. And then the most difficult situation, and I was talking with someone about this before the talk, was what if the information moves? So imagine that you went out to the CNN website today and found a story on the vote for the flag amendment. And then a week from now, how would you refine that story? It's not on the front page of the CNN site anymore. It might be on the CNN site still, but if you search for flag amendment, there's probably 30 or 40 different stories. How do you know which one was the right one? And so when information moves, that is just a killer for refinding because the path that you know and you remembered taking to it no longer works. So we looked at these 4 things in terms of time, URLs, search, and familiarity. Now, in this data set, we only had 1 task where the information moved, so I didn't include that in this analysis. We're only looking at the exact path and subset. I'll talk about the move task separately in just a minute. And we found that time, search, and familiarity were all significantly different. So I'll drill down into one of these. We'll look at time, or I think I actually look at all of these. So the exact tasks were significantly different from the subset tasks, but neither were significantly different from the path in terms of time. So let me try to explain what this means. If the information, you're looking for one piece of information, if it's the same piece of information in both sessions, that was different in the amount of time it took than if you were looking for one piece of information out of a set. Okay, so that's interesting because it says that if I found a whole bunch of stuff, it's harder to get back to one thing than it is to get back to one thing when I only found one thing. Yes?
Did the subjects know they were going to have to refine the information?
That's a good question. They were not specifically told they were going to need to refine information. They did know that they would come back for a second session, and the study materials had, the IRB forms that they filled out had information about what the study was about. But we did not explicitly go out of our way to say you're going to be refining the same material. It was on the forms, and it was there presented to them, but we didn't make a big deal out of it. Okay.
I'm just wondering, very often in my experience, when people know they're likely to have to go back to something, then they're likely to use that tool,
Yeah.
or local bookmarks, or
Right.
sticky notes, or something, so that
Right.
which then routes around path changes because they're going
Right.
directly to some kind of permanent
And
location.
that's definitely true. That is a great area to look at as well. This might be more applicable in the situation where there's actually a name for it. It's called post-value recall, where you don't realize the value of the information until afterward. And so something you saw today, and then you and I are talking, and I mentioned something, and you're like, oh, I just saw an article on that.
Do you think it was also skewed at all by the fact that they weren't using their own computers? Because in looking at, in particular, how my students and how my children refine things, much of it is autocomplete from the URL.
Right, right. Yeah, now, we did some things to specifically erase and restore browser caches between participants. I don't remember if autocomplete was part of that, but we did go in and try to, definitely between participants we tried to erase the caches, and I know we tried to restore them when the participant came in the second session. I don't know how extensive, I don't know if autocomplete was included in that, but you're definitely right, and that's one of the things that we lose in this kind of a study. And there's some things, like you mentioned, that are really good that you get a little more, validity, ecological validity in when you can observe somebody at their own computer. But this one, we wanted to look at some very precise things, and it was, more practical to bring them into the lab. So, but I'm very interested in those things and would love to do a more naturalistic study. So, okay. So this is also looking at the similarity, the exact path and subset tasks, and this is a weird result. This one says that the exact path, or the exact tasks and the subset tasks, people, used search about the same amount, okay? But that for some reason, the path tasks, this is the information where the information was just a little different. It was the different Kroger store, it was the one on University rather than the one on Main Street. For some reason on those tasks, they didn't use search much at all. And we really kind of sat down and scratched our heads about this one, and there's a couple different possible reasons for this. One reason is that maybe the nature of those tasks, because the information is something that's very similar to another piece of information, that it's probably something you already know. Now, another possibility is that we introduced a bias in our tasks when we created our tasks, because we were trying to think of two pieces of information that lied along the same path, and so we thought of things that we knew. And it's possible that our participants also knew them in their head without searching. So it kind of points to a potential difficulty in studying this kind of thing. You have to be very careful.
Well, do you know how much they use search the first session for those tasks?
Yeah.
Is it the same?
Well, yeah, so what this would be, oh, I see what you're saying, to distinguish it across session. I'd have to look at that. Yeah, I'm sure I've got it somewhere. I just don't remember it off the top of my head. Maybe something about those tasks.
Continuing along what Mary said, if you're looking for an address for a Kroger store nearby,
Right.
the first time you would search for Kroger and use the web search engine.
Right.
Second time you would directly go to Kroger.com
Right.
for location, store locator.
Right.
So
Right.
you don't need a search engine
Yeah.
every time around.
No, that's a good issue. I should go back and look at the data and see if there was a spike on the search in the first session. Yeah. See, and I'm being recorded, so I don't have to take notes on this. I can just go watch the video and remember how to follow up on these questions. So also we found that in terms of the familiarity, the subset tasks were a little bit lower in terms of people's familiarity of how to get back to that information or how confident they felt they knew where it was. Again, this is not terribly surprising because they had seen a number of things and they were trying to pick out one in particular. And so, it's just saying that when you've got a larger set and you're trying to zero back in on that one thing that you want to get to, you feel a little less confident in where it is than if it was just one thing you were looking at to begin with. So in terms of the success rates on these two sets, I wanted to point out the move task. This one I hadn't included in the other analyses. In the first session, we asked them to find a news article on a particular topic, and 15 of 17 people found it. In the second session, only 2 of 17 were able to re-find the same article that they said they had read on the first day. And we did ask them to actually read the article as part of the first task, so that they didn't just go to a site, find an article, and forget about it. We did ask them to actually read the article in the first session. But I think this really shows the difficulty of that type of task.
Did they read the article?
I watched them, and yes, they at least made an attempt to read the article.
Maybe you're just testing the memory and not the ability to navigate.
Well, it could be, but that's the nature of that sort of task, too. I mean, if you've, if something...
Supposing you had given them, a paragraph from the story, that might have been interesting.
Okay.
Test.
Oh, I see. To test whether this effect was due to memory rather than in terms of the refinding.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. So now I just want to kind of give you some observations about strategies that we observed people doing. We often found that people use the same starting approach to refine something that they did to find something. So I don't have the whole numbers on this, but we coded the starting strategy. In other words, what was the initial action that they took? What URL did they go to? Did they search? Did they browse? And very often they use the same strategy that they used to find that they did to refind. We also found that people know a set of sources, and this is a set of URLs that people carry around with them that they just know, and they use them as jumping off points. So things like dictionary, Yellow Pages, ESPN, movies, weather, the Virginia Tech site for academic info, search engine addresses. These were things that people just typed in and went. They knew them, and they could very easily use them as jumping off points. And an interesting thing about that is that a lot of these resources that they used as jumping off points or that they used as resources have a paper counterpart. So, if you're looking up a word in a dictionary, people went to dictionary.com or mw.com as a replacement for a real-world dictionary. If you're looking up a phone number, lots of people, almost all, went to yellowpages.com as a replacement for their local Yellow Pages. Movie times, instead of looking in the newspaper, they went to some kind of a portal site. A lot of people went to movies.yahoo.com by going through the Yahoo main page and clicking on movies. Temperature, again, instead of looking in the newspaper, calling a phone line, almost everyone went to weather.com. I found that interesting because I used the NOAA.gov site, and almost no one used NOAA.gov. And the same kind of thing. Instead of looking in an academic handbook, they knew the place to go on the Virginia Tech website. So I think it's interesting that there are these counterparts that people go to find and refine information that have sort of replaced the paper sources. So let me try to wrap up. In terms of do finding and refinding differ? Yes, they do in terms of some tasks, but not for all tasks. Search engine use seems to be affected by the task, not by finding or refinding. The familiarity was influenced by just one session, and it didn't necessarily reduce the time, but they did feel more familiar with a number of the tasks. Task and familiarity both had effects on time and search use. We had some easy tasks and difficult tasks that we observed on a number of measures. Task similarity did seem to affect refinding in terms of refinding for those subset tasks were perceived as more difficult and took longer. And tasks where information moves are very difficult. Strategies we found that were used is that for a lot of tasks, people did use the same strategies that they'd used the first time to try to refind it, and they have a known set of websites that they carry around with them and make use of. So I think I'm going to touch on one more thing. Somebody asked me a question at the beginning talking about frequency and familiarity and the relationship between the two. So one of the things that we've, this is sort of in the early stages of thinking about, but what does it take for a task to move? You can think about finding and refinding as being on some sort of a continuum, relying in some sort of space, where things that you've never done ever before and don't know anything about might count as a finding task. Things that you know about and do all the time count as refinding tasks. And so you can look at frequency on one axis and familiarity on another axis, and finding tasks kind of fall down here where you don't do a task very often and you're not very familiar with it. And maybe as you get doing things more, you kind of go back to a site occasionally or get to information periodically. Maybe you go there once a month or once a semester. And then maybe there are things that you do very often where your familiarity and frequency is high. And I've kind of shaded this way because this quadrant doesn't really seem to, what are things that you do very frequently that you aren't familiar with? That's a little bit of a strange thing. So we're kind of evolving this model of how you move through your knowledge of a task and it moving from being a truly finding task to a very knowledgeable task that refinding is very easy on. So that's just something to think about at the end. So if there are any questions, I'd be happy to take them.
The stuff about yellowpages.com looks remarkably similar to the old puzzlement at HP. How come their 67 made no end of money while their 81 barely broke even or slightly better? Where the explanation I heard was the 67 replaced the slider, which every engineer had. The 81 replaced nothing a financial guy had, so they didn't know which way to hit it. It's all a while back.
Huh.
And what I got is apocryphal.
Interesting. Yes?
So along those lines, there's certainly a pencil and paper analog of finding distance. So you break out a map and you either chart it out or you look at a table that says distance from this city to this city, etc.
Right.
Was there a connection between these other tasks that you found with a paper analog and the similarity to map distance finding?
I didn't specifically look at that. But the map distance task was actually an interesting one because of the multiple needs for information. You needed to find the starting location and an ending location and then figure out that distance. And I mean, most people used MapQuest for that task. So, but yeah, I mean, there would be an old-fashioned way of breaking out a map and, measuring it. So.
Does the map finding task lay any information on the issue of what percentage of people can usefully read a road map? I heard it as numbers who can't estimate between 10 and 60 and 90% by various guesstimates.
I guess MapQuest kind of takes that away if you're just looking for the difference, right? Because you don't even have to read the map in that case. So, yeah. Any other questions?
So let me just get, because the notion of familiarity as you use it is self-reported.
Yeah, these were self-reported measures.
How accurate were they would be?
Well, that's one of the downsides of using a self-reported measure unless you try to check it. Now we did have, we could probably go in and look at the times that it took them to do that task. Matter of fact, I think I may have done that analysis to see if familiarity correlated with the time. And I want to say it did, but I don't want to be a liar, so I'll tell you I don't remember. But I think there was a pretty strong correlation there. So that I do remember I did an analysis to just give us a sanity check on the self-reported measures, and it's escaping me right now exactly what the results of it were, but they gave us confidence that the self-reported measures were good. So, yeah.
At the end, you sort of put up that spiral diagram about this sort of transition from finding to refinding.
Yeah.
And a lot of the things that we've talked about, you talked about how questions have come up, how memory is part of refinding.
Yes.
How are they actually refinding the task? Or are they actually refinding the information? Or are they learning the finding task?
Mm-hmm.
And it sort of leads me to question if you can parameterize finding to refinding as a single dimension. Or
yes.
Is it potentially more complex than that?
Yeah, I suspect it's more complex than that. Matter of fact, if you think about dimensions that play into the refinding, what does it mean to be a refinding task? There are a lot of other dimensions that I haven't gone into details about here. I mean, time is obviously one of them. How long was it from the finding episode to the refinding episode? And you know, cognitive psychology has done a lot of measurements in terms of how memory decay works. And it would be very interesting to look at a longer-term study to see if any of those cognitive psychology models actually map onto what happens here in terms of time. I mean, there's also things like fan-out. So cognitive psych also has the theories that talk about if you have a number of different pieces of information that are all very similar, that they create interference, and that makes it more difficult to recall one of the items that you've seen. And we saw some evidence of that with the subset task, but surely not conclusive evidence. There were only a handful of those kind of tasks in this study. So yes, there are definitely more dimensions than what we've looked at here. Yeah?
I was wondering about the level of expertise of the students in terms of how familiar they are, like the early adopters versus the non-early adopters in terms of technology. And this really stems from the question of why not the fourth quadrant of high frequency with no familiarity. I'm thinking, in IT help desk worker, when they see a user who records down on a list the steps to do a certain technical procedure, they do it very often, but they never remember how to do it.
Oh, that's really interesting.
I feel that would be statistically significant and significant for your research.
We did do a pre-survey questionnaire in this where we asked people about their web experience, and these were all frequent web users that were, people that had been using the web for a while. So they were, your average undergrad at Virginia Tech already comes in with a fairly savvy web use knowledge. But that's a very interesting take on that fourth quadrant about people that write down steps to do things. So yeah, that's possible. But I suspect we didn't have any of those people in this study. But yeah.
That also goes into memory. If they're following the steps that are written down, they don't actually have to process it in their memory. They just have to remember to follow the steps.
Right.
Which means that there's no, I guess this arrow, they never follow an arrow to sort of memorize this, so the refinding becomes familiar.
Now that's actually very interesting too, because if you think about, say you create a bookmark or a toolbar mark that, you don't remember the URL, you just always click on that button. And then when you're away from your computer, oh gee, what is that URL? And, you probably created it because the URL was kind of complicated anyway. And so that's been one of the things that we would get if we looked in a more naturalistic setting of people in their own computers and, not using a computer in the lab where they didn't have their own bookmarks and that sort of thing.
Well, I'm on the live papers team, so we're trying to fix that issue.
Oh, good. Excellent. All right.
More questions? Okay, let's thank our speakers.